7 people saw it. 7. And for the next 30 years, not one of them spoke about it publicly. Not because they were threatened, not because anyone told them to stay quiet. Because what they witnessed in Gate 12 of Los Angeles International Airport on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1972 simply did not fit inside any language they knew. A 265-pound undefeated fighter stepped into Bruce Lee's path. 8 seconds later, that man was sitting on the floor, eyes wide, mouth open, trying to remember how to breathe. This is what happened. By the fall of 1972, Bruce Lee was something the world had never produced before and has never quite replicated since. He was not simply famous, he was mythological. And he was mythological while still being alive, still buying groceries, still catching flights, still existing in the ordinary machinery of daily life. That was the strange thing. That was the dissonance that people couldn't process. You'd read about him in newspapers as though he were a force of nature, and then you'd turn a corner and there he was, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds, carrying a gym bag through an airport terminal like anyone else. Enter the Dragon was still in post-production, the film that would detonate across the planet and permanently rewrite what cinema could be, what a Chinese man could be on a Western screen, hadn't yet been released. But the Whisper Network was already running. People in the industry had seen footage. People in martial arts circles had heard stories. Word traveled. Word always traveled when it came to Bruce Lee. He had just wrapped filming in Hong Kong. He was flying back to Los Angeles to continue work, to train, to move toward the next thing. Always the next thing. Bruce Lee's mind never settled. It churned, it synthesized, it reached forward into territory that hadn't been named yet. He moved through the terminal at LAX the way he moved through everything, contained, precise, aware of every square foot of space around him without appearing to look at any of it. People on his team, a production assistant named Danny, a young student named Wei, walked slightly behind him, not because he demanded it, because his gravity simply pulled things into orbit behind him. The terminal was loud in the way airports are loud, overhead announcements bleeding into each other, the mechanical groan of luggage carts, a television mounted near Gate 9 playing the evening news with nobody watching. And then, near Gate 12, there was Raymond Sykes. You need to understand who Raymond Sykes was, because this story only works if you understand the world he came from. Sykes was 29 years old. He stood 6 feet 2 inches. He weighed 265 pounds, and nearly every pound of it was functional, built not in a gym for aesthetics, but in rings, in gyms with no mirrors, in tournaments held in places that didn't make newspapers. He had been fighting competitively since he was 17, amateur boxing first, then a drift toward full contact circuits that operated on the edges of sanctioned sport, the kind of events promoted in hotel ballrooms and armories, the kind where the rules were loose and the audiences were serious. He had compiled a record of 41 fights without a single official loss, 11 knockouts, a broken jaw dealt to a man in Denver that the man still felt when the weather changed. Sykes was not a braggart in the conventional sense. He didn't wave his record around at parties. He carried it internally, like ballast, something heavy and reliable at the center of him that kept him upright and certain. He believed in the hierarchy of physical dominance the way some people believe in gravity. It wasn't philosophy. It was simply the observable structure of reality as he had experienced it. Big men hit hard. Big men absorb damage. Big men win. He had the evidence, 41 fights, 41 files of evidence stored in his body. He had been in Los Angeles for a regional competition. He was flying home to Phoenix, carrying a trophy that he hadn't bothered to take out of his checked luggage because he had too many of them already to care. He was sitting near Gate 12 when Bruce Lee passed. His travel companion, a trainer named Bert, 50-ish with a face like a collapsed building, nudged him, said a name, pointed. Sykes looked up. He saw a small Chinese man in a dark jacket walking through the terminal with fluid, unhurried steps, gym bag over one shoulder, quiet, compact, generating some kind of attention from the people around him in a way that Sykes couldn't immediately account for. Bert said the name again, and Raymond Sykes did something that he would spend years trying to undo in his memory. He laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, that's important to note. Raymond Sykes was not at his core a cruel man. It was a laugh born entirely from incomprehension. Because what Bert was telling him, what the Whisper Network was telling him through Bert's mouth, was that this man was the most dangerous martial artist alive, that this man had moved through the martial arts world the way a blade moves through water, that fighters who had trained their entire lives had stood in front of him and found that their entire lives had not been enough. And Sykes looked at him, 5 feet 7, 135 pounds, smaller than Sykes' 17-year-old nephew. The laugh was biology before it was a decision. Bert, who had been around long enough to be uncomfortable, said something cautious, something like, "I wouldn't, Ray," the kind of thing you say when you already know you won't be listened to. Sykes stood up. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't in a rage. He was operating from a place of genuine, settled certainty, the kind that 41 fights without a loss will carve into a man's nervous system as surely as scar tissue. He was going to introduce himself. He was going to shake Bruce Lee's hand, and somewhere in that interaction, in the easy, unconscious display of his own physical mass, the hand that swallowed other hands, the shoulder width that rearranged space, he was going to make clear what he believed to be simply and obviously true, that he was the dangerous one in this room, that size was the final argument. He stepped forward into the terminal corridor. Bruce Lee stopped. This is what the 7 witnesses described in private years later when the story finally moved in fragments through the people who knew them. Bruce Lee stopped before Sykes reached him, not startled, not reactive. He simply stopped and turned, as though he had known the large man was coming before the large man had fully decided to come. His eyes found Sykes immediately, not the sweeping, assessing look of someone cataloging a threat, more like the calm, specific look of someone who has just been handed a problem they already know the answer to. Danny, the production assistant, stepped slightly to the side. He had seen that look before and had learned what the geography around it meant. Wei said nothing. Sykes approached and stopped about 4 feet away. He was smiling, the particular smile of a man who was very large standing in front of a man who was not. "You're Bruce Lee," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Bruce Lee looked at him without expression, not cold, not hostile, simply present, the way a wall is present, completely there, occupying its space without apology or elaboration. "I've heard a lot about you," Sykes said. His voice was casual. His body was not. His body was doing what bodies do when they are being used as a statement. Shoulders back, chest forward. The full volume of 265 pounds arranged in the most legible way possible. Bruce Lee said nothing. Sykes gestured at him, a vague, sweeping gesture that took in his size, his frame, his existence. "I gotta be honest with you," he said, and he was still smiling. "I don't get it." The people nearby had begun to notice. A businessman paused mid-stride. A woman with a carry-on bag slowed without stopping. The terminal, in a radius of about 30 feet, was developing the particular quality of air that gathers before something happens. "I've seen your movies," continued Sykes. "I've seen what you do, and I respect it, I do. But," he held out one of his hands, palm up, offering it as Exhibit A. The hand was enormous. "But I just don't see how that works against this." He wasn't threatening. He was genuinely presenting a thesis. Bruce Lee looked at the hand. Then he looked up at Sykes. He said quietly, so quietly that only Sykes and the 2 people directly behind Bruce Lee could hear it, "Would you like to find out?" And the smile on Raymond Sykes' face did something complicated.
There is a moment, and fighters know this moment better than anyone, where the body performs its own arithmetic before the conscious mind has caught up. Sykes' body ran the numbers in the half-second after Bruce Lee's question. 265 pounds versus 135. 6'2" versus 5'7". 41 fights versus, what, movie sets? Demonstrations? That one famous incident with that other guy that nobody could fully verify? The arithmetic came back clean. The arithmetic came back with a number that Sykes' entire adult life had taught him to trust. He nodded. It was a slow nod, the nod of a man who is trying to appear more reluctant than he is. "Show me something," he said. Not fight me, not let's go. He was still performing nonchalance, still inside the register of a man who is absolutely certain of the outcome and is mostly curious about the mechanics. "Show me your best shot," he said. "Right here." He tapped his own chest. Once, twice. An invitation. "I want to see what the fuss is about." He was still smiling. The people nearby had stopped pretending to do other things. 7 of them, arranged in a loose half-circle, close enough to see, far enough to maintain the fiction of not watching. Bert, sitting 20 feet away at the gate, put down his magazine. Bruce Lee looked at Sykes' chest where he had tapped it. He looked back up at the man's face. He exhaled once, a single quiet breath, and he set down his gym bag. What happened next has been described in 7 different ways by the 7 people who saw it, but on 3 things every account agrees completely. First, the speed. Second, the sound. Third, the look on Raymond Sykes' face. Bruce Lee did not wind up. He did not shift his weight in any telegraphed way. He did not adopt a stance, did not square his shoulders, did not do any of the things that a body does when it is about to do something. He simply did it. A straight right punch, not a movie punch, not a demonstration punch designed for cameras and controlled environments. The real thing. It traveled approximately 14 inches. 14 inches. The distance between where his fist started and where Raymond Sykes' chest was, and in that 14 inches it generated something that the human eye could not track and the human mind could not fully process in real time. The sound it made when it landed was wrong. That's the word 3 of the 7 witnesses used, independently, years apart. Wrong. Not the expected thud of a fist on a chest. Something more interior, something that suggested the force had moved through the surface rather than simply against it. Sykes' feet left the floor. This is the detail that strains credibility until you've spoken to someone who has been hit by a truly elite striker in their prime. The feet left the floor. Not much, an inch, maybe 2, but they left it. And then Sykes was moving backward, not falling forward, and then he was sitting on the airport carpet with his back against a row of seats, and his trophy, which had migrated somehow from his checked back to his carry-on at some point that morning, skidded out from beneath the seat next to Ken as though the impact had traveled through the furniture. 3 seconds passed. Nobody moved.
Raymond Sykes sat on the floor of Gate 12 at LAX and stared straight ahead. Not unconscious, not injured, not truly, though his chest would display a bruise for 11 days in a near-perfect circle, like a brand. He was staring ahead because his nervous system was engaged in a complete audit of everything it believed to be true and was finding results deeply disorienting. Bert stood up from his seat at the gate. He sat back down. Bruce Lee picked up his gym bag. He looked at Sykes on the floor, not with contempt, not with satisfaction. Something closer to acknowledgement. The look of a man confirming a fact he already knew. He said nothing. He turned and walked toward his gate. Danny followed immediately. Wave followed Danny. The small orbital procession continued down the terminal corridor as though nothing had interrupted it. The businessman who had paused mid-stride resumed walking, but in the wrong direction, and had to correct himself. The woman with the carry-on bag stood completely still for another 4 seconds before her body remembered what it had been doing. Raymond Sykes did not stand up for almost a minute. When he did, Bert was next to him. Bert said nothing. Bert had the wisdom of a man who had been around long enough to know that some things don't benefit from commentary. Sykes touched his own chest, pressed his fingers against the place that would bruise. He looked down the terminal in the direction Bruce Lee had gone. Bruce Lee was already gone.
There is a specific kind of silence that follows something impossible. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of sleep or peace or nothing happening. This was the silence of 7 people standing inside an experience that their minds were actively refusing to file. Raymond Sykes sat on the airport carpet for 53 seconds. He knew it was 53 seconds because he counted. Not deliberately. His mind simply began counting the way a body begins breathing after submersion. Automatic, involuntary. Something the nervous system does when it needs to reestablish the basic rhythm of existing. 1, 2, 3. The carpet beneath him was a forgettable industrial gray-blue, the kind of carpet designed to absorb the traffic of 10,000 strangers and show nothing. He stared at a section of it approximately 2 feet in front of him and understood, somewhere beneath language, that he was now one of those strangers, that something had just passed through him like weather passes through a place, leaving the landscape technically the same but fundamentally altered in ways that only become visible later. 41 fights. He had been knocked down before, twice in his early 20s, before he had fully developed the defensive instincts that later made him nearly impossible to put on the canvas. He knew the feeling of impact, knew the way the world tilted and realigned. He had cataloged that feeling and filed it under setbacks, temporary interruptions in the narrative of his dominance. This was not that. He had not been knocked down. He had not been stunned by force accumulating over the course of an exchange, feints and bodywork in the slow hemorrhaging of equilibrium that a sustained fight produces. There had been no exchange. There had been no sustained anything. There had been a man picking up a gym bag and a single movement that his eyes had registered only as a result, not as a process. And then there had been the floor. 14 inches. He kept returning to that. 14 inches. He had seen Bruce Lee's arm when he stood before him, had assessed it the way he assessed all arms, as a weapon system, with relevant data points, reach, thickness, muscular development. The arm had been lean, defined certainly, the arm of someone serious about their conditioning. But not an arm that should have been able to do what that arm had done. His chest ached, not sharply, not the acute radiating pain of broken bone or torn cartilage, something deeper, something concussive that lived beneath the surface in the tissue itself, like the arm had introduced a new frequency into the structure of him that his body didn't know how to resolve. Bert helped him up on the 54th second. Bert said nothing. This was the single most respectful thing Bert had ever done for him. They walked to their gate. Sykes did not look back down the terminal. He already knew there was nothing to look back at. The 7 witnesses scattered into their separate lives within the hour. The businessman, a commercial real estate developer named Harold Chen, who happened to be Chinese-American and who happened to have grown up watching early kung fu serials in San Francisco theaters with his father, caught his flight to San Francisco and spent the entire journey in a state that he would later describe to his son as religious, not metaphorically. He meant it with precision. He had just watched something that functioned the way miracles were supposed to function, not by suspending physical law, but by revealing how much of physical law remained unexplored, how much room existed in the possible that most people never approached. The woman with the carry-on bag, a nurse named Patricia Delgado, flying home to San Diego after visiting her sister, told the story exactly once that same evening to her husband over dinner. He didn't believe her, not because he thought she was lying, but because the story, as she told it, contained a detail that human intuition rejects, that a fist traveling 14 inches could move a man weighing 265 pounds backward off his feet. Her husband smiled in the gentle, patient way of someone who loves you and thinks you have embellished slightly. Patricia Delgado never told the story again, but she thought about it for the rest of her life. She thought about it every time someone in her professional world confused size with capability, confused mass with power, confused the appearance of strength with the actual architecture of it.
The 5 others, a young soldier on leave, 2 college students who had been arguing about something before the incident and did not resume arguing afterward, a gate attendant who was technically on shift and technically should not have been watching, and a retired high school wrestling coach from Ohio named Donald Marsh, each carried the memory in their own particular container. Each returned to it at intervals. Each found that it retained its charge over the years in a way that ordinary memories do not. Ordinary memories flatten. They lose resolution. They become approximate. This one stayed specific. This one stayed lit. Donald Marsh, the wrestling coach, was perhaps the most analytical of the 7. He had spent 30 years teaching young men about leverage, about the mechanical reality of body versus body, about the cold physics of combat stripped of ego. He understood better than most what it meant to be strong. He understood what elite physical conditioning looked like at its upper range. He spent the 3-hour flight back to Ohio running the geometry in his head. The angle of Bruce Lee's elbow had initiation, the rotation of the hip that he had caught only as an impression, peripheral, instantaneous but there, the lock of the shoulder at contact, the follow-through that wasn't follow-through in any conventional sense, not the extension of force outward but the projection of force inward, like a key turning in a lock rather than a hammer striking a surface. He filled half a notepad with sketches and calculations and finally put the pen down somewhere over New Mexico and looked out the window at the darkness below. He had been teaching physics to teenagers in a gymnasium for 30 years. He had never seen anyone do that. He ordered coffee. This is not a detail inserted for comic effect. This is what happened. Bruce Lee reached his gate, sat down in one of the plastic seats, and asked Danny to get him a coffee from the small concession stand across the corridor. He drank it while reading a paperback, a philosophy text, the spine too worn to read the title, and said nothing about what had happened at Gate 12. Danny did not ask. Wei, sitting 2 seats away, watched Bruce Lee read his book and drink his coffee, and wondered, as he had wondered many times during his time studying under him, whether the man was truly unaffected or whether he had simply developed the ability to process things at a speed that made the aftermath look like nothing. He had asked him once, not about this hadn't happened yet, but about something similar, a confrontation that had resolved itself quickly and decisively, and that Bruce Lee had then moved past with what appeared to be complete indifference. Bruce Lee had looked at him for a moment before answering. The fight is not the interesting part, he had said. The fight is a test result. You already know what you know. You already are what you are. The fight just confirms it. Why would I spend energy thinking about confirmation? Wei had thought about that for weeks. He was thinking about it again now, watching Bruce Lee turn a page. The boarding announcement came 30 minutes later. Bruce Lee finished the coffee, closed the book, picked up the gym bag. He joined the boarding line. He did not look back toward Gate 12. To understand why this moment matters, why it belongs not in a footnote but at the center of any honest reckoning with what Bruce Lee was, you have to understand what he had built inside himself, and why the exterior dimensions of a man like Raymond Sykes were not data points he had ever found useful. Bruce Lee had arrived at his art through an act of intellectual demolition. He had learned Wing Chun first, the classical system, structured and codified and ancient, and then he had done something that the tradition did not expect and did not invite. He had questioned it, not with hostility, with rigor, the same rigorous questioning that he applied to everything, the same demand that a thing actually work, actually produce the result it claimed to produce, or be discarded. He had trained with boxers and discovered things that Wing Chun had not taught him. He had trained with wrestlers and discovered things that boxing had not taught him. He had read everything. Fencing manuals from the 16th century, modern kinesiology texts, research on fast-twitch muscle fiber activation, the writings of Sun Tzu, Krishnamurti. He had approached the question of combat the way a scientist approaches a problem, not by defending an existing answer, but by following evidence wherever it led. What emerged was Jeet Kune Do, not a style. He was adamant about this. Styles were cages. Styles were answers frozen in time, applied to all future problems regardless of whether they fit. Jeet Kune Do was a method of inquiry. It was the practice of meeting the actual situation with actual response, not the filtered, systematized response of a tradition, but the direct, immediate, efficient response of a mind that had shed the excess weight of assumption. And what he had discovered, what the training and the reading and the ceaseless self-examination had revealed, was that the most dangerous weapon was not the heaviest weapon. It was the fastest. It was the most precise. It was the weapon deployed before the opponent had completed the neural process of perceiving a threat. The one-inch punch, the demonstration that had made audiences at the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships go quiet in a way that audiences at demonstrations did not usually go quiet, was not a trick. It was not a special technique designed for controlled conditions. It was the product of a principle, the principle that force does not require distance, that energy can be concentrated and released with such efficiency that the usual prerequisites, the wind-up, the telegraph, the slow accumulation of momentum become unnecessary, become liabilities in fact, because they give an opponent time. Raymond Sykes had stood before him with 265 pounds of mass and 41 fights of certainty and had offered his chest and had smiled. He had offered his chest because he believed that his mass was the point, that it was the fundamental variable in the equation, that what Bruce Lee could produce, whatever it was, would be absorbed by that mass the male large body absorbs ordinary things. He had not understood that he wasn't standing in front of an ordinary thing. He had not understood that Bruce Lee had spent 20 years removing every unnecessary variable from the delivery of force, removing the wind-up, removing the tell, removing the distance, until what remained was purely the force itself. Concentrated, compressed, instant, 14 inches.
Raymond Sykes continued fighting for another 3 years after the airport. He won. He kept winning. The record extended beyond 41 because the body still functioned. The opponents still fell. The arithmetic of size and conditioning still produced the familiar results in the familiar rings in the familiar cities.
But something had changed in the architecture of his certainty. It was not gone. He was not a broken man. That would be too simple, too dramatic, and untrue. He was still dangerous, still skilled, still in most rooms he entered, the most physically imposing and combat-capable person present. But the certainty was no longer sealed. There was now a small aperture in it, a tiny, precise circle, approximately the size and shape of what a single fist moving 14 inches had introduced, through which a different kind of understanding occasionally passed. He began, in small ways, to study, not to abandon what he knew, but to extend it. He read things he would not have read before. He watched footage he would not have watched. He thought about the geometry that Donald Marsh had sketched in his notepad over New Mexico, though he and Marsh would never meet, and he began to develop his own incomplete version of the same calculations. He never talked about the airport publicly. His trainer, Bert, to his credit, also never talked about it, and Bert was a man who talked about nearly everything. It was not shame. Sykes would think about this later and be clear with himself. It was not shame. He had stepped forward in good faith with a sincere belief. He had been wrong. The wrongness had been demonstrated clearly and without cruelty. There was nothing in that transaction to be ashamed of. It was something else. Something closer to reference. The word surprised him when it arrived, years later, sitting in a gym in Phoenix after a training session, reading a magazine profile of Bruce Lee published after his death, a profile that described his philosophy, that quoted him on the nature of combat and the nature of the self. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless, like water. Sykes read that. He put the magazine down. He thought about Gate 12, about the man who had looked at him, at all 265 pounds of him, without adjusting, without the flicker of calculation that Sykes saw in every opponent's eyes, the moment when they did the arithmetic and found the number troubling. Bruce Lee had looked at him and found nothing to calculate, not because he was reckless or unaware, because he had already moved past the level at which size was the relevant variable. He was operating in a different register entirely, a register where what mattered was not mass but truth, the truth of where the body was, where it would be, what the fastest path between one point and another looked like, and how to travel that path before the other person understood a path existed. Sykes set the magazine on the bench beside him. He had spent his life believing in a particular kind of power. He still believed in it. He just knew now that there was another kind above it. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. Enter the Dragon was released 18 days later. It became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. It broke box office records across 3 continents. It introduced a generation, then another generation, then another, to a man who moved through the world as proof of a principle, that the quality of what lives inside a person is not predictable from the outside dimensions. The 7 witnesses at Gate 12 learned of his death in the way everyone learned of it, through news broadcasts, through morning papers, through the phone call from a friend who had just heard. Each of them in that moment thought about a Tuesday afternoon in September 1972, about a man who put down a gym bag, about 14 inches, about the sound. Harold Chen, the real estate developer, was in his office in San Francisco when he heard. He sat for a while with the door closed. He thought about his father, about the theaters of his childhood, about a man who had remade the image of what a Chinese man could be on a Western screen, not through brute accommodation, not by making himself larger or louder or more legible to a culture that had spent decades refusing to see him, but by being so precisely, so completely, so devastatingly himself that the world had no choice but to reorganize around it. Patricia Delgado was on shift at the hospital. She heard from a colleague. She thought about her husband's patient smile across the dinner table when she had told him the story. She did not find this funny, she found it quietly sad, not for Bruce Lee, but for all the things that happen and leave no record, that pass through the world and get absorbed by the gray-blue carpet of ordinary life and become only the private property of 7 strangers who happen to be standing in the right place. Donald Marsh was in his gymnasium. He put down the equipment he was holding and sat on the bleachers. He thought about the notepad, about the sketches, about the geometry of a thing he had spent his entire professional life trying to teach and had finally, once in an airport terminal, seen performed at a level that made his teaching feel like rough drafts. He thought, we had him for 32 years. He thought, imagine what 40 would have looked like. Here is what that moment at Gate 12 was not. It was not a fight. It was not a performance. It was not a demonstration designed for an audience or a legacy or a story to be told later. It was a man who was asked a simple question, is size the point? And who answered it in the only language that question truly understands. Not words, not argument, not the careful assembly of evidence and counter-evidence in the long, slow court of intellectual persuasion. One movement, 14 inches, 8 seconds including the time Raymond Sykes spent on the floor. Bruce Lee spent his life building one argument, that the human body, trained with intelligence and disciplined with honesty, is capable of things that our assumptions about it prevent us from discovering, that the ceiling we believe in is almost always a wall we built ourselves, that style is a prison and tradition is a comfort, and real mastery is the willingness to test everything, including yourself, against the hardest available reality and to change accordingly. He was not the biggest man in any room he ever entered. He was something more difficult to become and more rare to encounter. He was precisely what he had made himself, nothing more, nothing less,
Nothing added for the crowd, just the truth of a man, moving through 14 inches, at a speed the eye cannot follow. They said size was power. 7 people at Gate 12 in September 1972 know differently. And now, so do you.